My name is Ben Kemp, Grant Cottage Historic Site Operations Manager, and I'm so pleased to be joined today by Nick Sacco, who is a park ranger at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site outside of St. Louis, Missouri. As we look towards the 200th anniversary, this is a series we'll be doing called In the Footsteps of Grant, where we discuss different aspects of Grant's life with people who work at the historic sites. And it's a wonderful network. I've been to some of the sites. I have to admit, I haven't been out to St. Louis, but I intend to do that. I think that our sites have a lot in common. Both sites were saved by grassroots efforts in the 1980s, and both sites really focus on periods of Grant's life that are lesser known. So it's wonderful to make this connection, and I'll let Nick tell you a bit more about how he got involved and some of his work that he's done. Thanks so much, Nick, for part in this program.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. And, me personally, I am a park ranger here at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. And sort of my entryway into the National Park Service in the first place is that I had an internship. I was finishing up my bachelor's degree, and the original plan was to become a high school history teacher. And I got all the training to become a teacher for the classroom. And in my last year of pursuing a bachelor's degree, I was encouraged to apply for an internship at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, and I got it. So I worked a year, I was in the uniform, and I learned about life in the National Park Service, and I really just kind of fell in love with the idea of studying history with the National Park Service. Grant's life story is extremely fascinating in and of itself, but I really was drawn to some of the larger themes and questions of 19th century history, looking at the Civil War era as a whole, antebellum, the war itself, and then Reconstruction. I just could not stop reading books and wanting to learn more about this period in American history. So long story short, a couple of years passed, and I got a master's degree from Indiana University in history. And there just so happened to be an opening back here in St. Louis at the Grant Historic Site, and I got selected. So I've been here at the Grant Historic Site for about 7 years now, doing all manner of work, group reservations, education programs, historical research, giving tours of Grant's home. All sorts of stuff that I do here to keep me busy. And scholarship wise, I've tried to contribute to various discussions about Grant's own life and try to highlight more of the stories about his time here in St. Louis. And I suppose that perhaps most notably in September of 2019, I got an article published in the Journal of the Civil War Era, kind of looking at Grant's relationship with slavery and trying to question some of the accepted knowledge, trying to complicate that particular relationship, and to look at the ways that slavery and the political debates about slavery shaped Grant's thinking on the topic before, during, and after the Civil War. So that's kind of where I fit in. I'm more of a political, cultural, and social historian. But above all else, I pride myself as being a public historian, doing what I can to work with people from all different backgrounds to educate them about America's history.
When it comes to Grant's pre-Civil War life, it's typically consolidated to a very simple perspective of he struggled. He was a failure at everything but the military. And I feel like there's a lot missing in that interpretation of Grant's earlier life that doesn't really explain why he struggled. It doesn't explain, what are some of the circumstances. So I don't think anybody debates that he may have had some struggles, both financially and health-wise, prior to the Civil War. But I think there's a lack of understanding, and I believe that you there at that site play a vital role in answering those questions. So I would say, what was the struggle really like, according to the records that you've seen? What was the struggle like? Um, how bad was it? What contributed to it? And if I can throw one more on, what's with the story of the pawned gold watch for Christmas? That's the big story that comes out of this period. So if you can
Sure.
answer those questions, that'd be great.
Sure. I guess for just a real quick background, so to sort of set the scene, so Ulysses Grant is first connected to St. Louis after being stationed at Jefferson Barracks, which is a military post about 5 miles south of where we are today at U.S. Grant National Historic Site. While here in St. Louis, he meets his future wife, Julia Dent Grant, at her childhood home, Whitehaven, which is the house that we take care of here at the park. And they get engaged and they get married, and Grant serves in the Army for 10 years. And then in 1854, he decides he's had enough of military life and he decides to come back to St. Louis. And so our primary focus of interpretation is this 5-year period when Grant is living at Whitehaven as a farmer from 1854 to 1859. So to your point, Ben, yes, a lot of consolidated histories, a lot of biographies that don't spend too much time on this part of Grant's life. You know, the big takeaway is that it was just ultimately a complete failure. And that's a very simplified version of the story. Grant, as a farmer, he is looking to raise mostly fruit and vegetable crops here: corn, wheat, potatoes, apples. During the winter and during times of struggle, he'll also cut down firewood, and he'll sell firewood in downtown St. Louis to try to make ends meet. So, and then of course, Whitehaven is a plantation at the time. So Julia Dent's family, they have 850 acres of property. They own upwards of 30 enslaved laborers. And we know that Grant himself owned an enslaved man named William Jones for part of the time that he's here as well. But ultimately, I think you first have to kind of look at, why did Grant choose Whitehaven in the first place in 1854? He's been in the Army for 10 years, and during much of that time, he's been separated from his wife and children. From 1844 to 1848, when Ulysses and Julia got married, they only saw each other once in that 4-year period. Later on down the line, in 1852, Grant sent out to the West Coast. Julia and their young children are here at Whitehaven, and there's a 2-year-old son, Ulysses S. Grant Jr., who's here at Whitehaven that Grant has never seen before. So too often, Grant feels like he's got to make a choice between his job and his family. So while he's got this career stability in the U.S. Army and a regular paycheck coming in, there's still something larger that's missing from his life, and it's his family. So moving to Whitehaven, there are certainly risks involved. There's no guarantee that Grant's going to work out as a farmer here at Whitehaven. And although he had experience farming in the past, it's a hard way to make a living, and there's definitely risk involved with it. But for Grant, this is the first time his entire family's all living together underneath the same roof. This is a time for him to kind of have a new beginning in his own life and to have a home where he can establish roots. It's a place that he can call home after many years of almost a nomadic lifestyle in the U.S. Army. So on the farming side of things, yes, it did not work out according to plan, but there's a multitude of factors that play into that. In the preface of Grant's memoirs, the first line is, "Man proposes and God disposes." And that is Grant's way of basically explaining that, whatever plans we have in life, sometimes what actually happens with those plans is sort of out of our hands. And I think with farming, you have a multitude of factors. You have a terrible economic panic in 1857. People are losing jobs, they're out of work. The value of Grant's crops is plummeting. There's also bad weather. We're here in the Midwest in St. Louis, where sometimes we get all 4 seasons in a day. And we know that based on meteorological records, that the year 1857 in particular was unusually cool. In the month of July, 1857, it averaged about 75 degrees outside, which feels great for humans, but it's terrible for growing crops. And then Grant himself suffered from malaria. He says in his memoirs that from a young age in Ohio, he consistently fought migraines and fevers and aches and pains from malaria. And there's a noted time when a number of family members were all very sick here at Whitehaven fighting with malaria. So, Grant, it didn't work out, but at the same time, a lot of it wasn't necessarily his fault. And on top of all of that, more importantly, these 5 years that Grant lived here, the Ulysses and Julia had several children. They ended up having 4 kids that they raised here at this house. The family came together, had plenty of wonderful moments together as a family. And I'll never say that somebody's a failure for being a great father and being a great husband. And so, in that sense, he was not a failure at all. These were years of happiness and joy. They were years of struggle and hardship, but, really hard to look at it as an absolute, utter, complete failure, because these were happy years for the Grants as well. With regards to your story about the pocket watch, essentially in late 1857, things are not really going great here at Whitehaven, and Grant did go to a pawn shop and he pawned off this gold pocket watch that he had previously acquired and owned for a number of years. Now, the story with it was that because the date, he went in December of 1857, so the date, people kind of made the correlation like, oh, well, Grant, he pawned it off so he could get presents for his kids. There's actually not anything in the historical record to confirm that 100%. We have the actual record at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum recently displayed that pawn store receipt, and it's included in Grant's papers, but there's nothing to verify that it was actually for Christmas presents. Really, more than anything, it'd probably just be reasonable to assume that it'd be for food and clothing for the entire family.
I think what you said that really stuck with me the most is that Grant was, struggled, but the but in it is that he was able to provide for his family. I know that later on, members of the family mentioned that in that time period, he was sick. He had some struggles. He was happy to be with the family, as you mentioned, but there was always provision. Nobody went hungry. Nobody went, maybe they didn't have the nicest clothing, but they had basic necessities. And I don't know if they would even have been considered poor. I know that some financial help came in from Julia's father, I believe at times, or assistance in other ways. Grant's father was a little more reluctant to sponsor Grant's activities at a place that had enslaved individuals. Now, that leads into the second part and kind of your forte. It's two-part really, and the first part is, what was Grant's relationship specifically with his father-in-law, and then what was the kind of, we refer to it as a Romeo and Juliet experience where the two families did not mingle, did not really mesh at all, the Grant family and Julia's family, the Dents, at Whitehaven. And so perhaps you could speak to that, what that division was like, what kind of challenges that brought to their relationship, and then kind of look at it in the broader sense. But what do we know that speak to Grant's relationship with the enslaved people, or with slavery itself? If you could speak to those two things that are kind of intermingled there, the families,
Sure.
the two families separation, their relationship, and then specifically Grant's relationship with slavery.
Sure, absolutely. So to your point, Grant is raised in a family in Southwest Ohio that is strongly opposed to slavery, and Grant's father, Jesse Grant, was the mayor of Georgetown, Ohio at one point when Grant was young. He was politically outspoken. He wrote letters to the editor and op-eds for the Castigator, which is the local newspaper there in Georgetown. So, Ulysses Grant grew up in a household that followed politics and followed current events and kept up with what was going on in the news. But interestingly enough, when Grant goes to West Point for his schooling, he does tend to gravitate more towards Southerners. Most notably, he's close friends with James Longstreet, the future Confederate general. And then for our purposes here, Julia Dent's brother, Frederick Dent, is a roommate and close friend of Grant's at West Point. And as previously mentioned, this was a plantation with enslaved laborers here at Whitehaven. So Grant kind of gravitates towards those types of personalities. And when he's here at Jefferson Barracks and he comes out to Whitehaven for the first time to meet the Dent family, by all accounts, he was pretty enthralled with the place. He found it very charming here at Whitehaven. He liked the pace of life here. He felt very welcomed. It was a very warm household. Grant's parents were a little more standoffish. They weren't necessarily a family that shared their emotions at the dinner table. And the Dent family is much more about sharing emotions and in talking openly at the dinner table, and the fresh home cooked meals that Grant gets here. So he really likes the lifestyle here at Whitehaven. And while I would say that when he moves here in 1854 to become a farmer, the family motivation is the primary thing. But there is the consideration of the fact that enslaved laborers are here at Whitehaven, and Grant accepts that. Jesse Grant had said he would never move to a slave state because he couldn't think of being in an area where slavery was allowed. Ulysses Grant doesn't take that position, and comes here to Whitehaven, and he benefits from enslaved labor, and not just William Jones, but we know that Grant hired out enslaved people from other slaveholders here in the St. Louis area, and that was part of the deal being here at Whitehaven. So I would argue that in terms of the two families, yes, allegedly at one point, Jesse Grant described the Dent family as a tribe of slaveholders. And Grant's parents, they did not come to the wedding here in St. Louis when Ulysses and Julie got married. And interestingly, their 1848 marriage, it's about the same time that the Methodist Church is splitting. The Dent and Grant families are all Methodist, but we see a split over slavery, and the Southern Methodist wing of the church breaks off in support of slavery. And there was a Southern Methodist minister who presided over the Grant wedding, which is another thing we've sort of speculated, is that maybe Grant's parents didn't want to see their son married by a Southern Methodist minister. Now, Frederick Dent Sr., Frederick Fayette Dent, Grant's father-in-law, he is an interesting figure, a strongly pro-slavery person. He aspires to be sort of a Southern gentleman, and that's kind of what he's created here at Whitehaven with the 30 enslaved laborers and 850 acres of property. Frederick Dent was more of a Jacksonian Democrat. So interestingly enough, when the Civil War breaks out, he doesn't want to see the Union broke up. He says to Grant that he wants to see the Union together, and he fears the Civil War. But at the same time, he also tells Grant that he doesn't want to see the Union. He doesn't want to see any state coerced to stay in the Union. If Mississippi wants to leave the Union, let him go. So in Grant's mind, his father-in-law is a secessionist because he's sort of taking this conditional unionist position, and Grant says, no, you got to support the Union no matter what. And it makes no sense for the U.S. Army to be unable to police its boundaries if a state just wants to up and leave. So I think there was genuine disagreement about the legality of secession, the nature of disunion. These were things that would have been debated in the 1850s when Grant was here, and they certainly had their differences of opinions on that. But when it comes to slavery, it might be somewhat murky. I would not say that Grant is a zealot, a fire-eating pro-slavery advocate, but at the same time, maybe there wasn't a strong disagreement between Grant and Dent. At the very least, as alluded to, Grant sort of accepts the way things operate here at Whitehaven, and he accepts slavery as protected by the Constitution. So my argument is that while we'll never know the true extent of Grant's views on slavery, he says in his memoirs that he voted for James Buchanan, the Democrat, in 1856, and had he been eligible to vote in 1860, he would have voted for Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas. So at least nominally, he was a member of the Democrat Party when the Civil War broke out. He opposed the Republican Party's efforts to stop slavery's westward expansion. He thought Abraham Lincoln's argument about a house divided not being able to stand, he didn't agree with that. But it was really going to take the Civil War itself to push Grant in an emancipation direction. After the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, Grant realizes that the Confederates, the point of no return has been reached. It's going to be a long war. The Confederates are not coming back under any circumstances. And he says in his memoirs that after the Battle of Shiloh, he realized that it was nothing but ultimate conquest that was going to lead the U.S. to victory. And attacking slavery could be used as a war measure to accomplish that. So Grant's later advocacy for civil rights for African Americans and support for emancipation, you don't really see that coming out into play in the 1850s when he's here at Whitehaven.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing to put into perspective Grant's relationship with slavery, which we can't know 100% from the available evidence, is that there was a spectrum of perspectives on slavery in that period. It wasn't just there was proponents of slavery. There was a middle ground where there wasn't a strong feeling either way, and then there was harsh opponents known as abolitionists. And I think Grant states, I was never what could be called an abolitionist. And I always find that statement very interesting because he makes some sentiments later in his life and in his writings that he really never felt comfortable with the institution of slavery on a whole. But it was legal where he was living. And so that, it leaves a bit of a gray area there. Now, there is one instance, and you know what I'm going to bring up, that really gets mentioned and used and utilized as an example of Grant being, significantly anti-slavery prior to the Civil War, and that is the manumission or the emancipation of the one enslaved individual, William Jones, whom he had the services of on his farm. And I also read somewhere that he actually employed free African Americans on the property as well. And there was reminiscences, interviews from people later on that said that Grant, could manage the slaves, or he couldn't, he had no, he would be out there working alongside them. He didn't have that same kind of master, enslaved relationship that would be typical. And I think, those kind of are interesting to mix those in and say, what was going. So can you speak to possible motivations for the William Jones emancipation?
Sure, yeah. So if we kind of work backwards, you mentioned, so Louisa Boggs, she's related to the Dent family. She's a cousin by marriage into the Dent family. And Louisa Boggs was interviewed several times about Grant because she was very intimate with the Grant family when they lived here in St. Louis. And she does say that, well, Grant wasn't hand to manage Negroes. He couldn't handle it. And basically saying that he just wasn't cut out to be sort of this Southern gentleman, this slaveholder. He was too kind to the enslaved people here at Whitehaven. And so, at least that was her perspective on the situation. And there's nothing in Grant's papers saying that he hired free people of color, although some of the interviews that were done after the Civil War suggest that he might have done that. He might very well may have done that. But we do have that letter that Ulysses wrote to his sister Mary about hiring out enslaved people from other slaveholders here in St. Louis. And then Mary Robinson, she was an enslaved woman who was here at Whitehaven, and she was interviewed by a St. Louis paper the day after Grant died. And the newspaper editor was very interested to hear what she had to say about Grant. So unfortunately, Mary Robinson doesn't really talk about her experiences at Whitehaven, but she talks about Grant and talks about him in a very, intimate, very conversational way. She talks about making jokes with him, and Grant had a dog named Leo, and he would run around and catch the chickens. And Grant would joke that the dog was going into business for himself because he was doing so good catching the chickens, and Mary Robinson couldn't keep up with them. So there seems to be, a pretty intimate personal relationship between Grant and some of the enslaved African Americans here. And I would argue that whatever his positions were on slavery, I do think during the Civil War, when Grant's fighting in the Vicksburg campaign and he establishes refugee camps in the Vicksburg area for enslaved runaways that have left and sought refuge with the U.S. Army, I think that's Grant's, he acknowledges the humanity of African Americans, and he takes that step because he wants to ensure that they're being cared for by the U.S. Army. So I think there's something to be said about Grant's regard for the basic humanity of African Americans. Now, with the William Jones story, you are correct. On March 29th of 1859, Grant decides that he's going to go to the St. Louis courthouse, which is today the old courthouse. It's right across from the Gateway Arch if you ever come here to St. Louis. And so Grant is going to make his way to the courthouse, and he signs this paper, the manumission paper, freeing William Jones. And many biographers have correctly pointed out that Grant could have earned $1,000 or $1,500 free by selling William Jones instead of just freeing him. And so, in a time of great financial distress, Grant decides to free him instead of making that profit for himself. And there is a level of courageousness to that move. After all, I sometimes point out there was other presidents in the past that they never freed any of their enslaved people. So Grant doing that is noteworthy. However, there's an important caveat to that story. And that is that Grant's wife, Julia, while she never legally owned any enslaved people, she was informally gifted 4 enslaved African Americans from her father, Dan, Eliza, John, and Julia. And so even after William Jones is freed, those 4 enslaved African Americans are still living with the Grants. And the Grant family is still benefiting from their labors. And as a matter of fact, when the Grants left St. Louis to move to Galena, Julia says in her memoirs that the Grant and the Dent families worked to hire out those enslaved people to other families in St. Louis. So they're not getting their freedom when the Grants go to Galena. So when you add that aspect to the story of the Grants continuing to benefit and live among enslaved people, it complicates the idea that Grant was freeing William Jones because he was ready to liberate himself from slavery. That may not have necessarily been.
I would say the other thing I'm interested in is the other symbolic thing that has to do with Whitehaven is hardscrabble cabin. And this is a structure that Grant is going to build at some point during his time at Whitehaven. And people use it as another symbol, like the pawned watch. To show the struggle of Grant, that he built this rough-hewn wood structure for them to live in. And so, if you could speak a little bit more to what his motivations would have been for building that, how long the family stayed in there, and why they moved out. I think those are some interesting questions. It's a very famous part of it's got where did the name hardscrabble come from? There's another one, but if you can explain a bit about the history around the hardscrabble cabin.
So yes, the story of the hardscrabble log cabin. So if we go back, first of all, when Ulysses and Julia got married in 1848, Frederick Dent gifted the newlywed couple 80 acres within the 850 acres here at Whitehaven. So when Grant leaves the Army in 1854 to start life as a farmer, this is what he has in mind, is he's going to work that 80 acres of land. And so building the hardscrabble log cabin is about seeking independence and becoming self-sufficient. It's not that Grant hates his in-laws or anything like that, but he wants to have a place that he can call his own. So he begins constructing the log cabin on the 80 acres that he was working on the farm. It's sort of on the northern part of the Whitehaven estate here. And it takes about 1.5 years to build hardscrabble. He does most of the work himself, cutting down the logs, setting up the design of it, getting the glass to build the windows on it. He did almost all of it. However, then in 1856 in the summer, they did have a house raising. And we do know that in addition to some of the neighbors coming by, there were some of the enslaved individuals at Whitehaven that assisted with raising the house and securing the house. So enslaved labor did play a bit of a role in assisting Grant with this construction of the log cabin as well. So the Grant family moves into Hardscrabble in October of 1856. Things quickly go wrong from there. Julia in particular, she hates Hardscrabble. She's the one who coins it Hardscrabble because it's just kind of, it's not like Whitehaven. It's not a nice, large, fancy home. She tries her best. She brings blankets. She brings other items to the home. She brings pictures, just doing whatever she can to make it feel like home. And she could never get that sense of home at Hardscrabble in the same way she felt about Whitehaven. So it's a struggle for Julia personally. And then Julia's mother, Grant's mother-in-law, Ellen Dent, died in January of 1857. So when Ellen passes away, Frederick Dent comes to Ulysses and Julia says, "Hey, can you come back to Whitehaven?" And the Grant said, "All right, we'll come back." So they moved back to Whitehaven. And within the 5-year period here on this property at Whitehaven, they only stayed at Hardscrabble for about 3 months. So it is in some ways sort of an experiment in independence for Grant, but it's very short-lived, especially with his mother-in-law passing away in 1857. So the log cabin has been moved several times, and it remains here pretty close to the property. There is an attraction across the street from Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. It's an animal park managed by the Anheuser-Busch family, the Busch family, the Anheuser-Busch company, and confusingly is called Grant's Farm, but that animal park across the street, that's where Hardscrabble is located today. The Busch family purchased it in 1907, and they've had ownership of it for more than 100 years. So unfortunately, it's closed and you can't take tours inside of Hardscrabble, although you can see it off of the nearby road adjacent to their property over there. But for us in the National Park Service, it's kind of a bummer because we do tours of Whitehaven and we don't quite have the capability to do Hardscrabble because it's owned privately.
So you mentioned that, some of the information that you get to interpret your site comes from the personal memoirs of Julia Grant. Can you tell us a little bit more about her memoirs and also the perspective that she gives in those memoirs?
Sure. Yeah. So Julia Grant is the first lady to write a personal memoir. So after Ulysses Grant dies in 1885, Julia began sort of kicking around the idea of writing her own memoir and sharing a narrative of her life that kind of centers on her own experiences. And so going into the 1890s, Julia will sort of start dictating her story, and Fred Grant, the oldest son, kind of starts writing down and transcribing what his mother is saying, and they put a manuscript together. But within Julia's lifetime, for a multitude of reasons, she wasn't able to get the book published. So fast forward to 1975, the manuscript had remained in the Grant family's hands all these years, but Dr. John Y. Simon, the late director of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant and the U.S. Grant Association, he will have Julia's memoirs published in 1975. So they are a valuable resource, in particular to Whitehaven here. About 1/3 of the book talks about Julia's upbringing here at Whitehaven. And I think there's a couple important takeaways from the memoirs. And importantly, they are in some ways, they kind of fit within the genre of plantation narratives that start to become very popular in the 1890s and 1900s. At this point in time, we're about 40 years out from the end of slavery in 1865. And throughout the South, you see people, people who are becoming elderly, they're getting older, but they still remember what life was like in slavery. So they tell stories and they write books about what the plantation was like for younger generations that didn't grow up in slavery. Julia's memoirs, in one way, they sort of function like this, because she talks quite a bit about the presence of enslaved African Americans on this property. And in her view, they were happy to be here. She believes that the Dents had treated their enslaved people like family. She talks about how the Emancipation Proclamation began the process of ending the comforts of slavery, in Julia's words. And she even admits at one point that, it was easy for her to just admit that to think that the house ran itself, because enslaved labor did so much of the work here at Whitehaven. So as an interpreter, you have to be very careful, because Julia names names in the book. She talks about African-American culture. The one example is Old Bob. Old Bob took care of all the fireplaces. He cut down firewood and kept all the fireplaces running in Whitehaven. And she talks about how Old Bob, he would the match would go out accidentally. And then so he'd have to go back out in the woods and get a new match. And then Julia kind of doesn't understand why Old Bob always had problems with the fire. But for us today, we can see, oh yeah, he's doing that on purpose, so that he have freedom of movement. So he get in the woods and get away from the Dent family and have a little freedom for himself. So there's little insights like that really help us try to get at least a little bit of an understanding of slavery as experienced by the African Americans here. But at the same time, it really romanticizes the experience. And you have to take some of Julia's comments at face value, because as you were mentioning earlier, while it does appear she came to accept the end of slavery and believe that slavery was wrong later on in life, you wouldn't know that reading the memoirs. And the memoirs, comes off as sort of a sad moment in Whitehaven's history when slavery came to an end. And she also tells us that the enslaved African Americans who were still here during the Civil War, they left the property during the war. So whatever Julia felt, the enslaved laborers were ready to vote for freedom with their feet during the Civil War. So it functions in that level as sort of a plantation narrative, but then it's also a very intimate look at the family relationships, an intimate look at Ulysses and Julia's relationship and their courtship and some of the conversations they had together. She talks about the 4 children and how much her 4 children gave happiness to her and her life. And so there's little moments like that as well that really help convey just how strong a marriage and how strong a family the Grants had. And that's equally important to the story.
Maybe you can speak a little bit to what is believed to have happened to the enslaved people
Sure.
At Whitehaven and when.
Sure, yeah. So Julia Grant herself traveled a lot during the Civil War. It's been estimated she traveled upwards of 10,000 miles because she's shuffling between her children, but then also going and visiting her husband at his headquarters and trying to spend as much time as she could providing aid and comfort and support for her husband during, vicious battles. She was down in Vicksburg during the Vicksburg campaign. She stayed with Grant in City Point, Virginia during the siege of Petersburg and the latter stage of the Overland campaign. So we're not 100% sure how, but the end of 1861, Julia came back from Galena, Illinois. She came to visit her father here at Whitehaven, and somehow she obtained possession of Julia, who was one of the 4 enslaved people that had been kind of gifted to Julia Grant when she was younger. So the enslaved woman, Julia, who was also referred to as Jewel or Black Julia at times as well, Jewel is actually going to accompany Julia Grant until early 1864. So it's actually another year after the Emancipation Proclamation where she is still accompanying Julia Grant during her travels. So whether they're in Covington, Kentucky, visiting Grant's parents, or they're in St. Louis visiting Colonel Dent, or Julia's visiting her husband in the camp, Julia, the enslaved woman, is right by her side. And there were some other officers in the Army that complained about this at some point here, about the fact that Julia was walking around with an enslaved person, and the sort of the irony, especially after 1863, is the Union war effort is one to end slavery, and yet here's Julia Grant with an enslaved servant. Now, Julia says in her memoirs that in early 1864, while she was en route back to Whitehaven and while stopping in Louisville, Kentucky, Julia, the enslaved woman, ran away. She escaped. And Julia Grant says that, well, Julia was afraid of losing her freedom by going back to Missouri. So that could be interpreted to mean that maybe she was already freed and earning wages, but feared going back to Missouri because the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply in Missouri. But we're really not 100% sure. In any case, Julia, the enslaved woman, she is gone by 1864. So General Grant himself doesn't really comment on this unusual situation with his wife. But you can see by 1863 that he's come out in support of a war to end slavery. He's establishing refugee camps and trying to find ways to provide aid to enslaved runaways. So I think his head by that point, he's ready to be done with slavery and move on to the next, move on to the work of promoting reunion in the country. So I think there's maybe a little bit of maybe not strong, but there's a little bit of a difference there with Julia's views and where General Grant is in his head by 63.
And I was under the understanding that it is believed at least that the enslaved people left at Whitehaven by 1864 may have taken their leave in 1864.
That's right. Yeah. So Julia Grant, kind of what we were talking about earlier, she came back to Whitehaven 7 different times during the Civil War to visit her father. And Colonel Dent had a stroke towards the end of the Civil War. So she really wanted to keep an eye on how he was doing. And so she says that when she comes back to Whitehaven in 1864, she discovers that the enslaved laborers who had still been at Whitehaven had all left and they were gone. So she reports that in her memoirs that that was pretty much the end of slavery at Whitehaven. And so you are correct. We do believe that it was probably at some point in early 1864 that the enslaved left Whitehaven.
Now, I want to kind of bring us full circle on Whitehaven. So we know it's where Grant met and courted Julia. So there's and where they raised their children, where they spend a lot of family time together. There's so much invested emotionally for Grant in this location. Can you speak to the what happens to Whitehaven up until the end of Grant's life, and do you think the emotional connection to the place plays into the fact that he retains some sort of management or ownership of the site? Anything you could fill in about the later activities at Whitehaven and what Grant's interest in it was?
Sure.
Did he ever want to go back there again?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So during the Civil War itself, around 1863, Ulysses Grant actually had Julia come back to St. Louis during one of these trips, and she reacquired ownership of the hardscrabble log cabin. That's a long story for another time, but before the Grants left St. Louis, Grant himself had sold hardscrabble to somebody else, and that man defaulted on his payments. So Julia Grant actually came back and reacquired ownership of hardscrabble in her own name during the Civil War. At the end of the war, Frederick Dent, father-in-law, he can't afford to stay at Whitehaven anymore. He's double mortgaged the property. He's owned it for more than 40 years, and yet he's upside down in debt. So the Grants decide that they are going to start buying Whitehaven in installments, kind of piecemeal process. And, there's some loose talk of the Grants maybe retiring to Whitehaven someday. That is something that is openly discussed. By 1866, General Grant has got full ownership of the Whitehaven estate. So he's the full owner of the property, and he decides that he is going to turn it into a horse breeding operation. So Grant is going to hire a caretaker to live inside the main house to run the farm operation. He's still growing fruit and vegetable crops, but eventually there's going to be a horse stable that's constructed, which is actually the Parks Museum today. And that horse stable is going to house upwards of 20 to 25 horses that Grant will either have shipped from Washington, D.C., or he'll purchase them in St. Louis and have them delivered at Whitehaven. So there's still an active management of the property, even while Grant is president of the United States. The Grants do come back and vacation from time to time. There's one rather interesting story from 1873 when the horse stable has been completed by this point. Grant decides he wants to come back and see how his horses are doing, and he takes a railroad. There's a railroad that cut through Whitehaven during Grant's presidency. The rail line was completed in 1872. And the story is that thousands of people here in St. Louis came to Whitehaven and waited for Grant and his family to come down the rail line. And then he got off the train and he went to go see how his horses were doing here at Whitehaven. So there is an active connection. And the Grants end up owning Whitehaven until a few months before Grant dies in July of 1885. So even though Ulysses Grant only lives here for 5 years, from 1854 to 1859, he's connected one way or the other for about 40 years of his life, from first coming to Whitehaven in 1843 and then owning it until shortly before his death in 1885. So now, I don't think the idea of moving back to St. Louis was that seriously entertained. And a couple reasons for that would be that Grant is elected president of the United States. So it's not like he can, the plans change in that sense. It's not like he's going to come back to Whitehaven immediately after the Civil War. And then 3 of the 4 Grant children did move to New York City after Grant was finished with the presidency. So he wants to be close to the children. He wanted to stay close to the family. So he ends up purchasing the home off of 66th Street in New York City, as opposed to coming back to Whitehaven. So the last known time that Grant came to Whitehaven was in 1883. He did come back to St. Louis and spend some time here at Whitehaven. But I think by that point in time, Whitehaven for both Ulysses and Julia was a distant memory. The significance of the home was in the memories that had been shaped here. The memories of the family being together, the memories of meeting as a young couple and starting the relationship here. But I think by the time Grant was even president of the United States, Whitehaven symbolized mostly memories.
So if you could, encapsulate briefly the modern history, including the movement in the 1980s, similar to Grant Cottage, where we had a movement in the 1980s
Right.
to keep the site or preserve the site and open it to the public, and keep it open to the public in our case. So if you could speak to that, and just to bring things full circle, do you have any plans at the site? Are you starting the planning phases for next year's 200th anniversary of Grant's birth? So if you
Sure.
that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So the long story short is that after Grant dies in July 23rd, 1885, the Whitehaven estate is going to go through 6 different owners over the next 100 years. And the house actually remains in private ownership until 1986. So in that 100-year period, the 850 acres eventually come down to 10 acres, which is the amount of property the Park Service owns today. The house is modernized with heating, air conditioning, indoor plumbing. The summer kitchen where the enslaved laborers worked is turned into a 3-car garage in the 1940s. So the home undergoes some changes, but thankfully the various owners who had been here did have a vested interest in the property. They were pretty good about keeping track of records. In 1940, before major renovations were made to the home, there were pictures that were taken that we were able to use to help us restore Whitehaven to its 19th century appearance. And so when the house went up for sale in 1986, when the last owners were ready to give up ownership, there were some newspaper articles that emerged. There were some rumors of potential developers coming in and creating a condo complex on the last 10 acres of the property here. And while local residents were very concerned about that, a preservation group called Save Grants Whitehaven was organized. And throughout the remainder of the 1980s, they're going to work both on the grassroots level, raising awareness and funds here in St. Louis, But then also going to Washington, D.C., there was a member of the Save Grants Whitehaven board who was actually on personal terms with George Bush, the President George Bush, and on personal terms with the Bush family. And on top of that, the Speaker of the House in the late 80s was Dick Gephardt, who just so happened to be the representative for this area of St. Louis County. So in 1989, the Congress is going to pass a bill that is later signed by President George Bush Sr. In October of 1989, establishing the Whitehaven and the remaining 10 acres as Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. So we have been here since 1989, and throughout the 90s, worked very hard to restore Whitehaven. It's still about 60% original today, despite all those different owners and changes. Giving tours of the home. We have an orientation film that we share with visitors. We have a museum in the historic horse stable that I mentioned earlier. And we're just trucking along. And over the past few years prior to the pandemic, we're having record visitation here to the park. And for the 200th anniversary, we have a number of different plans. We're looking to do some in-person programming, ideally, whether it be some living history, potentially some guest speakers coming to speak on the significance of Grant. We want to do some additional multimedia, particularly kind of what we're doing here, doing multimedia with other Grant-related historic sites to promote the various Grant-related historic sites throughout the country that people can visit. And we're also looking to do some promotional stuff with local organizations. Like I'm not guaranteeing this is going to happen, but of course we're all big St. Louis Cardinals fans here in this part of the country. And it would be really fun to have like US Grant Day at Busch Stadium on April 27th to commemorate Grant's 200th birthday. So we're kind of going around right now trying to make those asks of business leaders of the Cardinals and trying to see what they can do to help us promote Grant's 200th birthday here in St. Louis.
Now, to bring everything into perspective, what do you see as the great importance to preserving Whitehaven, the National Historic Site? How does it, how does it inform visitors that come there? And, what's your personal take? Is there anything that you believe is, an untold story or, something that we haven't mentioned already that you think is, something that offers contemplation or some sort of insight into American culture, that kind of thing?
Right. Yeah. I think there's really kind of three big takeaways for me. At the most foundational level, this is a site where you can learn about Ulysses S. Grant as a person. We're not a Civil War battlefield. We're a place that talks about political, cultural, and social history, and we're a place where you really get to learn about Grant on personal terms. So I think showing that side of Grant's life is very important because ultimately, you want to understand that your military leaders, you want to understand presidents, what drove them, what are some of the qualities of the characteristics and their personalities. People want to learn about those things, and we're a site that helps kind of further that goal. Kind of moving a little bit from there are very important stories beyond Grant. By law, we have to interpret women's history. By law, it says, federal law says we have to interpret Juliet Grant's life as well. So talking about Julia's life, talking about the role of women in shaping American history, talking about the history of slavery, talking about the enslaved experiences at Whitehaven, better understanding not just Grant's relationship to slavery, but why we had a war over the institution of slavery in the first place is very, very important. And then kind of the real big picture from there is that Whitehaven is, in some ways, it sort of symbolizes, it's a flashpoint of different political issues of the day. St. Louis and Missouri as a whole, we've got the Missouri-Kansas border war breaking out the same year that Grant moved to St. Louis. The Dred Scott decision begins in St. Louis, 12 miles from Whitehaven, and Grant and his father-in-law are reading the newspapers about the Dred Scott decision. In 1859, Grant's reading about John Brown's failed revolt against slavery in Harper's Ferry, and he's reading about the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. So crucial political history is taking place, and Grant's observing that, reacting to it while living here at Whitehaven. So this place helps us learn more about Grant as an individual, but it also helps us learn about the challenges the United States faces leading up to the outbreak of the Civil War.
Yeah, it's got a lot of important facets to it. You know, it's interesting, and you know, we find that even with Grant Cottage, that we find these other individuals that are involved, and there's these interwoven stories, and you know, it really, you know, the farther you get into it, any one story, you realize it's you know, intricately connected to the greater picture, the greater story of America. So
Right.
that's what makes you know, sites like the Whitehaven and Grant Cottage so meaningful to the public. But it also brings a humanity to a very mythological figure, the humanity of being a family man, being a father, being a grandfather, being a husband, and a provider. And there's something so, you know, relatable. And I think historic sites are, you know, I think it's better if they're relatable. And the more stories you tell, the more comprehensive of all the individuals involved. And I know that's a big emphasis in New York State, especially within the park system here, is to tell those marginalized stories within the park system or within the state park system and historic sites to really be able to understand the greater picture of America more better. And Grant himself said in his memoirs he wants history to be written accurately. That was his goal in writing his memoirs, that they'd be as accurate as he could make them, given his perspective. And I think that's the goal of most historians and historic sites, is to do that. And it sounds like you're doing a great job of it down there at Whitehaven. I can't wait to visit myself. Hopefully, maybe next spring I'll be able to come down and be there in person. But I've really enjoyed all the insight you've provided today, and you know, we enjoyed it so much. I think we're going to go ahead and invite you back in July if you'll come back. Well, you know,
Sounds like a plan.
we'll have we've got a wonderful panel discussion in July. You can find out more on the website grantcottage.org. And you know, we are privileged to have Nick as one of our panelists, and also Ulysses Grant Dietz, and Mary Kelsey. So we're really excited to have these three grant enthusiasts and researchers, and just it's going to be a wonderful event. What you've already given us has been fantastic. We can't wait to dig in a little further into the Grant family in July. Now, if people want to access your information, I know you have videos online. You have very interesting, very well produced videos. How can they find those?
Sure, and thank you so much, Ben, for the opportunity to be interviewed today. Really looking forward to the roundtable discussion later in the summer. And to answer your question, so on social media, so our we're at US Grant NPS, and that's sort of across all social media. So facebook.com/US Grant NPS, at US Grant NPS on Twitter, and at US Grant NPS on Instagram. So we're really trying to churn out a lot of informative scholarship. We have a bunch of articles on our website that we're always churning out new insights and new stories about Ulysses S. Grant, videos, social media posts, pictures. So we're very active and try to put out stuff every single day. So we stay busy around here.
So what is your as on a personal level, we'll just do a little personal thing here. What is your favorite story or quote involving Grant? I'll put you on the spot.
Man, it's funny because Grant is very, very quotable. There's a lot of great quotes out there. And I think, you know, I'd actually probably just bring it back to what I said earlier in the presentation with man proposes and God disposes. I think even if you're not necessarily a religious person, I think there's something to be said about, you have sort of these ideals, you have your goals that you want to accomplish in life. And the lesson of Ulysses S. Grant is that even when things don't go according to plan, you can still achieve greatness. And Grant himself didn't want to be in the military, didn't necessarily want to be a career military officer, and yet he becomes a military hero of the United States. He didn't necessarily have a strong view on slavery one way or the other before the Civil War, but then during his presidency, he ends up becoming a great champion of African American civil rights. There's evolution in Grant's thinking. He's willing to listen. He's willing to think anew. He's willing to challenge assumptions. So these are qualities that I really admire about Grant. And I think it all kind of goes back to this idea that, no matter what kind of plans you make in life, sometimes you get obstacles thrown your way. And the challenge of a successful life is just trying to navigate those obstacles.
Certainly, and I think that really plays into our story at the end as well. And what I really drew me to Grant Cottage as well was the fact that like your site, it gives an insight into who the man was on a personal level and how he faced his struggles and what made him successful. It seems like to me, from what I've learned, that he just had an incredible sense of duty that was overriding, and he would put his family first, he'd put his nation first, and he seemed to have an incredible knack for focusing on what was the most important and the most pressing of issues at any given time. So I think he was good at keeping focused and just incredibly persistent nature, which we certainly see both in the farming at Whitehaven and in his final struggle here to put the last words on his memoir. So that's what I love about speaking to people from other historic sites to do with Grant is you start making the links, the connections to this guy changed a lot. Here's some things we can see that character traits that he has throughout his entire career and life. And it's wonderful to be able to compare those things and contrast them. And again, I really appreciate your time today, and I'm sure our viewers will really enjoy this and be looking forward to your participation in the live panel discussion in July. Thank you so much, Nick Sacco, National Park Ranger, an educator from Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site outside St. Louis, Missouri. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.